All right, you've handed us Nassim Nicholas Taleb's The Black Swan, the impact of the highly improbable. It feels like we're about to go deep on those oh wow moments, the totally unexpected events that change everything. So, what kind of journey are we in for with this deep dive?
Get ready for a wild ride. Taleb doesn't just want you to understand these Black Swan events, he wants you to rethink how you see the entire world. And he argues these Black Swans are way more common than we realize.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. When Taleb says black swan, he doesn't mean an actual bird, right? What's the metaphor here?
Right, it's not about birds. Think 9/11, the explosion of Google, even a global pandemic. These are events that, looking back, might have had some warning signs, but were basically unpredictable beforehand.
And it's not just that they're unpredictable, it's the sheer impact, right? Like, these things don't just cause a stir, they rewrite the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's like the difference between finding someone a bit taller than average versus suddenly discovering a species of humans 10 times taller. Black swans shatter our assumptions. Plus, the more we try to explain them after the fact, the more we trick ourselves into thinking we could see them coming, which makes us even more vulnerable to the next one.
So how does this all tie into how much we can actually know about the future? It feels like Taleb's saying our crystal ball's pretty cloudy.
He is. He talks about these two domains, Mediocristan and Extremistan. Mediocristan's where most of our daily lives play out: height, weight, exam scores. Even if you get an outlier, it doesn't rock the boat too much.
And Extremistan is where things get a little more spicy.
Spicy is an understatement. This is the realm of Black Swans. Think book sales. One book like Harry Potter can sell millions of copies, making almost every other author's success look tiny in comparison. Suddenly, the old rules don't apply. And this isn't just about books. It's wealth, pandemics, all kinds of things.
Whoa, that's mind-blowing. So you're saying we should be looking for those hidden gems where the risks are low, but the payoff could be huge.
That's one way to look at it. It's about understanding where you are. If you're an Extremistan, you need a whole new playbook.
Okay, so we're bad at predicting black swans, but Taleb goes a step further, right? Doesn't he say we're also bad at accepting just how bad we are at predicting them?
Yeah, he calls that epistemic arrogance, which is a mouthful, but basically means we think we know more than we do.
And it's not just overconfidence, right? Don't we kind of twist things in our minds to fit our own narratives? Like, we try to make the world seem more predictable than it really is.
Oh, absolutely. That's the narrative fallacy. Our brains crave stories, so we latch onto explanations that make sense, even if they're not the full picture. Like, remember when people thought the Titanic was unsinkable?
Oh, man. Talk about a story that got sunk. That's a rough example, but I get it. So even experts get caught up in this.
Big time. That Titanic captain, he was the expert of experts, and look what happened. We're all prone to it. It's like, we want to believe we can control things, even when we can't.
So how do we fight that urge? If we're wired for stories, how do we avoid getting tricked by the wrong ones, especially when it comes to something as unpredictable as a black swan?
Well, Taleb talks about the importance of silent evidence, which sounds kind of strange at first.
Silent evidence? How can something be evidence if it's silent?
It's like this. Imagine a guy, super lucky, takes crazy risks, always comes out on top. You might think, wow, he's got it figured out. But what about all the other guys who took the same risks and didn't make it?
Ah, I see. So it's like we only hear the success stories, the survivors, the ones who made it through. We don't see all the failures.
Right. We miss half the story, so we get a warped view of how risky things really are. Taleb uses the example of Giacomo Casanova, the legendary lover.
Casanova, what's he got to do with it? Wasn't he like really lucky in love?
Exactly. He thought he was invincible, taking all these risks, always bouncing back. But what about all the other would-be Casanovas who tried similar things and didn't live to tell the tale? We don't hear their stories, so we overestimate survivorship and underestimate risk.
Wow, that's kind of a dark example, but it makes sense. So how do we avoid falling into that trap? So, okay, if we're practically wired to misunderstand these black swan events and we can't even predict them, are we just destined to be caught off guard? Like, is there anything we can actually do to navigate a world with these lurking surprises?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom, thankfully. Taleb actually offers some really practical strategies for dealing with a world where black swans are inevitable. One of the key concepts he talks about is convexity.
Convexity? That sounds a bit, I don't know, mathematical for all this uncertainty we're talking about.
It might sound a bit technical at first, but it's a really powerful idea. It essentially means looking for situations where the downside is limited, if things go wrong, but the upside. The upside has the potential to be huge EE, especially if a positive black swan comes along.
Oh, I see. So kind of like hedging your bets, but with an eye towards those game-changing events that could blow everything out of proportion in a good way.
Exactly. And it's not just about financial bets either. It applies to skills, experiences, even relationships. The idea is to diversify, spread your risk, don't go all in on one single thing. That way, when a black swan does hit, and it will, you're in a much better position to adapt.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about that skepticism Taleb talks about? That seems like a pretty healthy approach in a world full of surprises, wouldn't you say?
Skepticism is definitely important, but Taleb's take on it is a little more nuanced. He's not advocating for skepticism just for the sake of it. What he's really saying is don't get bogged down in abstract debates that have no real impact on your life. Instead, focus on what's actionable, the things you can actually change, and be open to being wrong.
Ah, so it's all about being like a pragmatic skeptic, not getting lost in the weeds, but also not being afraid to question things and admit when you're wrong.
Exactly. He calls this being an epistemocrat, someone who understands that they don't know everything and that their knowledge is always limited, which is a very humbling but also liberating way to look at the world, don't you think?
Definitely. It's like instead of trying to predict the unpredictable, we should just try to be prepared for anything and be ready to adapt when things inevitably change.
Perfectly put. The world is full of these black swans, good and bad. And the more we understand that, the better equipped we'll be to navigate them.
This whole deep dive has been, well, a real eye-opener. It's made me realize that maybe instead of constantly trying to predict the future, which is obviously impossible, we should just embrace the uncertainty and try to find the opportunity in the unexpected, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. Embrace the uncertainty, stay curious, and always remember that sometimes the greatest opportunities come from the things we least expect.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for taking this wild ride with us through the world of black swans. And to our listeners, remember, life is full of surprises. Don't just try to weather the storm, learn to dance in the rain.